Okay, so today I thought we would focus down on curiosity as a personality trait that is really, I think, almost obligatory for a scientist if you're trying to prepare yourself to become one of these. Curiosity, killed the cat, but it's the kind of thing that people could argue is innate and inborn. It's one of those inborn personality traits. I used to think it was important for scientists to have self-confidence because in order to tackle a scientific problem, once you're aware that there is a scientific problem where you find out that people really don't know the answer to this particular question, a lot of people stop there because they don't have the confidence, the self-confidence that they can solve the problem better than maybe the next guy. But I think that the self-confidence in thinking about it over the last several weeks and so forth, is self-confidence isn't sort of an innate personality trait necessarily. I think the self-confidence comes from curiosity, because if you're curious about a particular situation or a particular thing, what you do in science is you go to the literature and you start reading about this particular area, and you read and you read, and one paper leads you to five more, and then you get, it just expands exponentially, and soon you're reading several hundred papers trying to get to the essence of the situation, or the essence of the problem. And ultimately you get to a point where you realize that nobody knows the answer. It hasn't been done yet, and that's the critical part in anybody's quests to do that. And to underline that, I have to tell a little story about a friend of mine who's a theoretical physicist from Sweden. This fellow called me up out of the blue one time when I was at Dartmouth, introduced himself. He said he'd read my papers, and he was a physicist, and he wanted to know about how cells decide to divide. And I had written several papers about this question. And how they make the decision, and because it's a really important decision in the life of the cell, because before the cell decides to divide, it has to duplicate its DNA. And you can imagine that that's a pretty critical decision on the part of the cell, because once it starts to do that, it can't stop. It can't just, sort of duplicate 10% of the DNA and then say, well, I don't think I'll do that, because then you have too much DNA hanging around in the cell, and that could lead to other problems, mutations and so forth, and cell death, essentially. So once the cell decides to divide, it has to know that this is really the right decision. And the question is, how does the cell do that? So I came up with a theory that's called the quantal theory of immunity, where the quantal is a term used in cell biology that means all or none. Either it does it or it doesn't do it. And of course, if you happen to be a theoretical physicist, that quantal is pretty akin to quantum. And he was a quantum physicist. And so he read these papers in biology, and he realized that there was a problem here, that people didn't know how cells decide. And so he called me up, and we started to talk, and one thing led to another, and we're lifelong friends. That was about 25, 30 years ago. And I visited him several times over in Sweden. He comes from what the English speaking people call Gothenburg, but the Swedes call Göteborg. And it's on the west coast of Sweden, about 3 or 4 hours by train ride from Stockholm west. And the thing is that he started, after we got to know each other and so forth, he started to read all these papers in biology, and he read extensively. And he would, every now and then, he'd stop and he'd call me up on the telephone again from Sweden, and to discuss this particular paper or that particular paper and what these people found. And ultimately he did this for, I don't know, a year or two. He was fixated on this particular question, this problem. And he actually gravitated from the point of how do cells divide to he realized that even before they have to decide to divide, they have to decide to replicate their DNA. And so he focused on that particular aspect of the problem. And so he was reading all these papers that I had never read myself. But ultimately, he got to the point where he said, Kendall, he told me, he said, Kendall, they don't really know, do they? And I said, well, you're absolutely right. They get to a point where, and then they're waving the cigar. The terms that the people use in the papers and the experiments, interpreting their experiments and so forth, they get to a point where they don't really know what's really going on and he was interested in the physical level. So biologists really stop at the molecular level. We don't get down to the physical level, really. I guess biophysicists do that. At the molecular level, and he was used to thinking at the subatomic level, right? So it gives you an idea of the kinds of things your mind has to deal with. So, but most biologists if they get low, they go to the molecular level, and at the molecular level, we know that, okay, this molecule changes into that molecule and so forth. But if you get down to the physical forces that's dictating those molecular changes, biochemical changes, people don't know. And so once he realized that it was going to take other kinds of experiments, he basically stopped. And he didn't go any further because he was a theoretical person. He wasn't an experimental physicist. And so he got to the point where he realized that he couldn't really find the answer. He wasn't going to find the answer in the literature anyway, but now he pinpointed where the question should be dealt with, essentially. So that's the kind of curiosity. I mean, he just wanted to know. He wasn't going to plan on doing anything about it once he found out, but that's the kind of curiosity that you have to have. And then the question is whether it's an innate personality trait that's an inborn part of you, written into the genes of your makeup, or not. And I myself have been curious all my life. When I was a little boy, I just, like most little kids, you're curious about all these things that you see around you and so forth and so on. And it turns out that my father was really a good source of information. He was sort of like a walking Google browser back in the days before there was such a thing as a Google browser, because he's an economist, but he was really an academic kind of a person, and he knew all kinds of things. And if when I'd ask him a question, if he didn't know the answer, he'd look it up, and the next day he'd tell me what the answer was. And it was great because I could just ask my dad, about this, that, and the other thing. And I think that's what drove me into science rather than, say, medicine. You get to a point in medicine where they tell you, just don't worry about it. I would always ask the question, why do we do this? Why did we do that? Why does this happen? And so forth. The why was the major question. And, most of the time they didn't know. The doctors just didn't know. And after a while, they just told me to shut up and do what they tell me, And that's one of the reasons that I left medicine. I didn't like that at all. I think that the critical thing in science then is to have the self-confidence that if you do go after this kind of a question that nobody seems to know the answer to, that you can solve the problem. And after I finally got to the point where after I had gone to many meetings and seen what was going on in the business and reading lots and lots and lots of papers and watching these techniques being used for that, I really got to the point where I had the self-confidence that if I tackled that problem, that I could make some headway on the whole thing. So it's really the driving force is the curiosity. You got to have the curiosity, and if you have the curiosity, then it leads you to the point where you, like my friend from Sweden, either has to throw up his hands and say, well, I can't go any further, or you have to try to go further. And that's what's so wonderful about science, is because what science is all about is creating new knowledge that nobody has ever known before. And so I'll stop there.